Well, howdy, howdy, everybody in the Committed 100. Glad you could be with us today for church history. Hopefully, you guys were with us for systematic theology and talking about conversion. That you were with us in Daylight Live with Pastor X, Dr. Howard, and Pastor Dave. Also, with that, just as a side note, hopefully you have your cups of coffee, ka-chink, your Bibles, pens, paper, notebooks, handy, highlighters. I'd had several questions over the past few weeks, especially when we were off during the holidays, about what resources are available for church history. First off, I have Philip Schaff's Church History multi-volume set digitally. It's a multiple volume, large and expensive set, but thankfully now it's available digitally. That is probably the pinnacle, the standard by which all other church history books are judged. I also have Schaff's compilations of the early church fathers that gives us insights into the early portions of the church. Also, probably one of the most standard textbooks in seminaries across America is The Story of Christianity by Gonzalez. 2 volumes. There's the early church to pre-Reformation, and then there's this volume, which is the Reformation of the present day. So currently, somebody's borrowing my first volume, but Justo Gonzalez. But also, there is a free 2-volume set through the Chapel Library. You can go to Chapel Library, and they offer free shipping. You can order, I believe it's up to $20 or $40 worth of material for free each month. They have a 2-volume set, The Glorious Institution, The Church in History, Parts 1 and 2 by Murrell. Also, Parts 3 and 4, The Glorious Institution, The Church in History by also Murrell. These 2 volumes are available on the Chapel Library website for free. I think because of its booklet nature, I think you can get one of these per month. So in 2 months, you can get this set for free or as a digital download. So feel free to grab those as a great summary of each of the lessons that we've gone through. With that, my ugly mug will get out of the way as we look at the early church councils. We've looked at what we would call the universal councils, councils of the whole church. Now we're moving to what's called the Catholic councils, and specifically also talking about the Waldensians as we're looking at this medieval period. With that, we move on to our next lesson in church history. As we start looking at some of these councils, we're also going to be kind of jumping. Unfortunately, it's really hard to linearly teach church history. Yes, I'll put a link to the page in the description and to the Committed 100. I have before, but I'll put a link as soon as this lesson is over. Here we go. That as we teach church history, Guten Tag, Michael, and hey there, Dr. H, that when we are going through this medieval period, it's really hard to teach it linearly because so much happens in between the councils, or some events and people are alive during multiple times during the council. There's going to be a lot of back and forth, either backtracking or going in the future and then backtracking. That I'm sorry, I will apologize ahead of time. As any of the church history books that I just mentioned also will not necessarily present things in a linear fashion, because it's hard to present history in such a limited scope or limited format because so much is going on at the same time. Today, we will prayerfully get through the first and second Lateran councils, as well as talk about a proto or pre-Reformation reformers in the people known as the Waldensians or Waldensians. And my computer doesn't want to work. Give me a moment, folks. There we go. The First Lateran Council was in 1123. We have to remember we've looked at the Crusades. We're kind of backtracking. We went through the Crusades and the effects of the Crusades. Now we're backtracking to during the time of the Crusades, what's going on back home, so to speak, with the church and developments theologically. At the same time, many of the men are out to battle along their way from either France or Europe into the Holy Land and back. Callistus II convoked a council to which all the archbishops and bishops of the West, remember this is post 1054, post the division between East and Western Church. So now these are called the Catholic councils because it's just the church in the West, the Roman Church, that is getting together and deciding these councils. 300 bishops and more than 600 abbots assembled at the church in Rome in March of 1123. Canons 3 and 11, as a short version, forbid priests, deacons, and subdeacons and monks to marry or to have concubines, as we already looked at the concubinage issue in previous councils. It also was forbidden for them to keep in their houses any woman other than those sanctioned by their ancient canons. In other words, unless you were a family member, you couldn't be in the same home as a monk or a priest. Marriages of clerics are null and void, and those who have contracted them are subject to penance. In other words, those that perform a marriage between somebody in the clergy and a woman was subject to punishment. Canon number 6 annulled the ordinations performed by Burdinus, anti-Pope Gregory VIII, after his condemnation. So any of the ordinations as well as marriages and other ceremonies were considered null and void. Canon 11, there was a safeguard for the families and possessions of crusaders. So while you were out on your crusade, there was a protection from, if it might be years or even decades that you're out to war, your possessions, even if you had debts, were protected by the church. Canon number 14 was excommunication of laymen appropriating offerings made to the church and those who fortify churches as strongholds. In other words, what was happening is the laymen that were at the church, those that were not part of the clergy, were appropriating titles and monies and position tied to the church. Hey, Dr. Crane, good to have you with us. Glad you could join us. We were talking about you earlier. I don't know if your ears were burning, but nevertheless we were. And against those who fortified the churches as strongholds. Remember, as the Crusades are going on, the class wars and separation of classes started to both deteriorate and to change and to morph. Going from a feudal system to more of an open system, and yet at the same time the type of slavery would change and the type of positions would expand. There would be many more layers in between lower class and a creation of a middle class that led also into new positions in relationship to the new monarchy, into having kings over you by the quote-unquote rule of God, by which then you would have dukes and bishops. Yes, Dr. Crane, it was all good. It was all good. Canon number 16 was against those who molest pilgrims on their way to Rome. There was many during the time. Of course, many of the men are out to war. This is the time of the Crusades. There was less law enforcement, shall we call it, that helped to protect travelers on the Roman roads to go to visit the great church in Rome. And so there was many raiders, as we already looked at during the Crusade period. Many of the Muslims had become raiders and giant caravans that made their trade off of pilgrims going either to Israel or going to Rome. Canon number 17 at this council, abbots and religious people were prohibited from admitting sinners to penance, visiting the sick, and administering extreme unction. singing of solemn and public masses, and they're obligated to obtain a holy chrism and holy oils from their respective bishops. In other words, the increased separation in positions and in authorities within the Roman Church expanded. So, in other words, there was an increased separation between clergy and laity, which said that those that were in lesser positions, such as abbots, weren't allowed to do the priestly or bishoply things of giving of penance for those wanting to make sure that they got out of purgatory, visiting the sick, and selling these oils and different balms. And by this point in time, the Catholic Church had also gotten into somewhat of a pharmaceutical industry in which oils and balms and minerals were sold under the auspices of the church, in which a particular priest or bishop has blessed these oils, and it'll make you feel better. In canon number 21 specifically, I wanted to address this, that they absolutely forbid priests, deacons, and subdeacons, and monks to have concubines or contract marriages. As a judge, between the sacred canons we have laid down, the marriage contracts between such persons should be made void, and the persons ought to undergo penance. This had already been established by the 300s. By the time Council of Nicaea rolls around 325, there had already been those that had taken vows of chastity. There was already discussion about a creation of a priesthood, which is absent from the New Testament, that we are all priests and kings under Christ, that positionally we are kings and priests. So the creation of this separate division between clergy and laity for a new priesthood that is supposed to mirror or reflect the Old Testament priesthood, we don't see. Yep, I know it, Dave. I know that they're still doing it. But let's look at the biblical models here. If in fact this quote-unquote New Testament priesthood is a reality, let's look at the Old Testament model and see if it's a direct comparison. The big problem with making a direct comparison is the Catholic Church at this point had said that the priests could not marry, that they had to take vows of celibacy. And yet the Levites married. In Leviticus 21 and Ezekiel 44, it gives descriptions of who they could and could not marry. Not a prohibition against marriage, but that, in fact, whom the Levites should marry. What type of women should they be? Interestingly enough, the Roman Catholic Church claims that Peter was the first pope. But the big problem with that is that if Peter was the first pope, Peter was disqualified because he was married. Jesus heals his mother-in-law in Matthew chapter 8. And there's no way of getting around the language that it was his mother-in-law, not just a relative, but his mother-in-law. We see that deacons and elders, as a qualification, are to be the husband of one wife. That's not forbidding them to marry. It, in fact, has a stipulation about not only whom they should marry, their qualities later on in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and in Titus chapter 1. But in fact, if they are married, it is only be one. So the only forbidding of anything is actually of polygamy. And as we see, all New Testament believers are a kingdom of kings and priests. Revelation chapter 1 verse 6 and Revelation chapter 5 verse 10. We move on to the Second Lateran Council, which comes just a decade later. Canon number 4 was an injunction to bishops and ecclesiastics not to scandalize anyone by the colors, the shape, or extravagance of their garments, but to clothe themselves in modest and well-regulated manner. something that for some reason the Catholic Church has totally forgotten. As we had previously noted, by the 8th or 9th century, cardinals had started wearing red, bishops and others had started wearing purple, priests had already started wearing black. There was already this division of clergy and laity by clothing and quality of clothing. As you'll notice in the modern Catholic Church, the higher up you go, if you're a cardinal, your clothing is rather more sophisticated and ornate than if you're just a regular bishop or a priest. It goes from very plain as a monk being basically a brown robe and a cord for your belt to a priest having much nicer black linens and clothing. Then when you move up to a bishop, it gets more layers and more ornate and more starting to see more silks and other fancy fabrics in their clothing. And once you make it up to a cardinal, many times each cardinal has their own tailor by which they design their cardinal robes. And yet they're totally forgetting Canon 4 here in the Second Lateran Council, in which to scandalize or to separate anybody by these colors or the shape or extravagance of their garments. Canon 6, 7, and 11 condemn the repression of marriage and concubinage of priests, deacons, subdeacons, monks, and nuns. Once again, there's still an issue with specifically keeping their vow of chastity. Seems to be a consistent issue with the Catholic Church throughout the millennia. Canon number 10 was excommunication of laymen who failed to pay their tithes due to the bishops. Let me pause there for a moment. The excommunication of laymen who failed to pay their tithes to the bishops. So if you were involved in ministry in the church, in order to help subside the bishops, those over multiple churches, there was basically a fee for doing ministry, in which was paid to the bishops. So if you wanted to be a part of the church, if you wanted to serve the church as a lay person, you had to pay up. Unfortunately, this became commonplace all throughout, as we looked in church history at the period of the last 3 centuries, the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, in which positions were being sold for money. Positions were given to family members and to children because of position, power, or money. Whether they received it from the bishops or obtained it from princes or other persons. In other words, you had to pay up no matter whether you got your position because of the church or because of your stature in society placed you in quote-unquote ministry within the church. Kind of sounds like modern church now, doesn't it? That the more and more you're involved in church, the more and more people want to know to make sure that you're giving. So much so that on more than one occasion, people have asked to see my personal giving receipts from the church to make sure that I'm, pastor is giving his fair share. Kind of reminds me of this particular canon, in which that's something between God and I, and my family and I alone. And yet it's expected that there's this, whether we received our position from a board or from the church or from some outside influence, there's this expectation that the tithes and offerings are above and beyond what others give. And I don't know what others give. I purposely don't. As I've told our church treasurer, I just need a monthly budget, what has come in, what has gone out. I don't need to know who gives or who gives what. If a large donation comes in, I don't need to know who it's from. I don't want to show favoritism to anybody in the church, or to think that just because they give funds that they need to have a title or position in the church. That's going back to the errors that we've seen in the church throughout history. Canon number 12 fixes the periods and the duration of the truce of God. Once again, going back to the treasury of merit, in which canon number 12 places restrictions on when priests can dole out penance, in which they can dole out this extra grace, stored up grace to give out to the people. Canon number 14 is a prohibition under pain of deprivation of Christian burial, of jousts and tournaments, which jeopardize life. There was an issue in having enough people to go to war. And so the kings and leaders that had these tournaments in which men would die was seen as a taking away of men that could be going to war. So the church said, you know, in order to put a squash on tournaments and having more men for war, we'll just deprive them of baptism, or deprive them of burials, deprive them of communion, such as we saw last week. The Roman Catholic Church still gives bishops authority to withhold communion and withhold other services of the church, shall we call it, if a person is deemed not in communion with the church. As we've mentioned, the bishop in New York has told his priests not to give our current president communion due to his stance on abortion. He has been restricted and withheld from the sacrament that helps to, quote unquote, keep him saved because of his position. That the church withholds these things for, quote unquote, sin issues, but also throughout history has been used to withhold for political power or for monetary gain. Kings and princes are to dispense justice in consultation with the bishops. So once again, the sacral church, the marrying of the church and the state together, was already in place by the 5th century. By the 5th century, the church and the state were so married, they were bosom buddies. Even more so once we get to this medieval period. Now with the creation of monarchies, the church wanted to be in league with the monarchies, to have equal powers. And so the bishops then were tied to the princes, tied to the kings, in order to together make decisions about not only secular things, but things in the church. No one must accept a benefit at the hands of a layman. In other words, if you were giving funds to the church, it couldn't go to a layman. It had to go to somebody in the priesthood. Nuns are prohibited from singing the divine office in the same choir with monks or canons. Once again, going back to the sexual issues and chastity issues of the previous canons. So they wanted to keep them separately, that singing was seen as a very personal and intimate action. And so if the nuns were to sing with the men, it was almost a form of sexual intimacy that the church believed, so that they separated them two. Canon 28, no church must be left vacant more than 3 years from the death of the bishop. Anathema is pronounced against those secular canons who exclude from the episcopal election of persons of piety, regular canons or monks. So in other words, if a church was empty because the bishop had died or had gone on crusade, that there must be a mechanism by which somebody is elected to replace him. And that it must be both secular and religious. Secular and religious. And they must be elevated to at least a person of piety, what's called a canon or a monk. That's why you start seeing in Europe during this time, especially once we get past the time of the Crusades, the 14th century and on, You start seeing more of a lesser priesthood within the churches. You start seeing monks being in charge over churches where previously it had been a priest or a bishop. That leads us to a heresy, quote unquote, that arises within the church. We see the first beginnings of what we would call proto-Reformation, those that wanted change within the church. Now, this is only, as we see, a century past the Great Schism of 1054. A person by the name of Waldes, and it goes by many different spellings, depending on number what country or how you want to anglicize the name. He led a group called the Poor Men of Lyons. He was a merchant who had turned into a monk. But as he became a monk and started studying theology, he found issues with the church, and especially the local church there in Italy. So much so that this large gathering of men in which he had found to follow himself in his new teachings actually ended up meeting with Pope Alexander the third, and to express their issues about, number one, the priesthood, about the nature of communion and baptism, and about many other things, in which shortly after Pope Alexander the third calls the third council and to declare them as being heretics. The Catholic Encyclopedia records the Waldensians as such. Among the doctrinal errors which they propagated was the denial of purgatory and the indulgences and prayers for the dead. They denounced all lying as a grievous sin. They refused to take oaths and considered the shedding of human blood unlawful. So, in speaking of shedding of human blood for religious reasons, they were conscientious objectors to the Crusades, shall we say. They refused to take oaths such as the vow of celibacy and chastity and of poverty. But also, they rejected, by this point, the ingrained sacramental system of the church. The denial of purgatory means that the sacramental system isn't meant to keep you out of purgatory. It rejects it as something that is done to keep oneself saved, that is a representation of Christ upon the cross. They also rejected indulgences, especially as they were offered to the Crusaders, and for prayers for the dead, those that were in purgatory, masses for the dead, in order to help assure them a speedy ticket out of purgatory and into heaven. What were some of the Waldensian core teachings? That they believed in the priesthood of all believers. They believed in a form of congregational polity in regards to the election of what we would call pastors, but they would still call priests. They had a, quote unquote, according to the Catholics, a low view of communion and baptism. You will see this charge leveled at some of the reformers, as well as what we could call modern day Baptists, that our low view of communion and baptism is because we don't see it as salvific in any form. With communion being an anamnesis, a remembrance of what God has done, and baptism being an outward sign of an inward change, and following in obedience, not because it is a sacrament of the church. They also struck a chord against the Catholic Church because they believed in having the Bible in the common language, in which Valls actually hired 2 priests to translate the Bible into the modern vernacular, in which the priests were punished, and the Catholic Church then considered the Waldensians heretics because of their removing it from the Latin into the common language. They had 3 different classes. There's sandalati, those who wore sandals, who received what they call sacred orders, in which they would take of the vows of poverty and chastity, much like the priestly vows that were in the Catholic Church at the time. Then there are the doctores, those who instructed and trained missionaries. In other words, we could say the seminary professors of the Waldensians. And then there was the Novellani, those who preached to the general population. The Waldensians were very missionary and gospel presentation minded. They wanted to present. Not a problem, Angel. You can always catch these teachings later. And you don't always have to catch it when it's live. That these three different classes modeled somewhat after the Roman Catholic system, but they were very missionary minded. They wanted to make sure that the gospel got out. It was about Christ and his death, burial, and resurrection, and not about the coming to the church, or because the Waldensians didn't have church. Many of them met in homes like the early church, and it's not until centuries later that the Waldensians would have their own churches. In 1184, the Synod of Verona, under the auspices of Pope Lucius III, they were excommunicated from the church, prevented from taking of communion in the church. Now you have to remember, up until 1184, starts in 1173, a decade later, they're removed from having communion in the church. This whole time, for those 10 years, they met in their homes, but they also continued to go to the Roman Catholic Church in order to have more converts to the Waldensian doctrines. Pope Innocent III went even further during the Fourth Lateran Council that we will look at. Wow, it's already been an hour. Maybe next week. Officially denouncing the Waldensians as heretics. In 1211, more than 80 Waldensians were burned as heretics in Strasbourg. This action launched several centuries of persecution that nearly destroyed the movement. The Waldensians briefly ruled Buda, the capital of Hungary, from 1304 to 1307. The Waldensians in turn excommunicated Pope Benedict XI, for very good reasons, by the way. In 1487, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull for the exterminations of the heresies of the Vaudois, shall we say, the inheritors of the Waldensian legacy. The Waldensians then, post 1487, then merge into the Reformation period, in which they joined the early Anabaptists. Yeah, Michael notes that looking forward to a link, our Luther Reformation Memorial has a huge Waldus here in Worms. I read a little more about Luther again in his later life. It seems he clearly changed his mind about Mary's contribution to our salvation and justification. It seems that he clearly turned away from his Roman Catholic doctrine. Eventually, yes. Someday I hope to be able to provide the sources I found. It may be interesting. Yes, it will. That would be great, Michael. Just a century after their papal bull against them for their excommunication, they joined the Reformation movement with both Calvin and Luther and Zwingli, but also they joined along with the Anabaptists, in which were being persecuted by the Reformation movement. So much so that we fast forward 300 years and they end up becoming a part of the Wesleyan movement, taking after Charles Wesley. Although being more Calvinist in persuasion, they end up joining forces, in which many of the Wesleyan churches in Europe by 16th, 17th centuries are Waldensians. There was in fact a merger in the 19th century between the two movements, the Waldensians and the Wesleyans. But they still remained very intact with some of their reformational doctrine and perspectives. Next week, we're going to pick up right here. The Waldensians are a rather interesting people. In fact, as a side note, I didn't want that to happen. As a total side note, I think Dr. White is rather astute when he mentions that when we start looking at the Waldensians, they also were not a unified group. That as we see the Waldensians morph and change during their early development, not every group, every home church, shall we say, had the same set of doctrines or beliefs. And in fact, due to the lack of records about what they actually indeed believed, there's a lot more to talk about what they did not believe than what they actually affirmatively believed. So many modern quote-unquote historians, especially looking at it from a Baptist perspective, such as in the book The Trail of Blood, try and place the Waldensians as the earliest Baptists, being pre-Reformation. I don't think that that's quite accurate, due to especially the modern anti-Calvinistic movement within the Baptist, within some Baptist circles, especially IFCA, Independent Fundamentalist Baptists, anti-Calvinism strains, would reject any linking back to Waldensians, and especially to the Reformation period. So to then claim that they're the early Baptists, when they hold doctrines and beliefs about salvation that are currently persona non grata among many forms of Baptists, seems rather odd to me, especially when we don't know exactly fully. They didn't have a systematic theology. That wouldn't come until the 19th century for those called Waldensians then. We don't know in those early, 12th, 13th century, what exactly was the teaching of the Waldensians. We knew they were gospel oriented, and we knew that they rejected some of the teachings of the church, but to immediately try and draw a line back to the Waldensians seems a little dishonest historically. Did they exist? Yes. Did they influence people that then influenced some of the reformers or some of the Anabaptists? Yes. But I don't think that we could say that it is some type of pedigree or heritage that we can immediately point back to the Waldensians and say, oh, well, that's where it started. That's where we get all this from. I think that's rather dishonest and short-sighted, as Dr. White mentions. But it is important to notice that even during the medieval period, there were those wanting to reform the church, those wanting to change the sacramental system, those wanting to bring the gospel to the people, bring the Bible into the language of the people. That was a catalyst later for the early and post-reformers. Well, I look forward to digging into some more of these church councils, starting with the Third Lateran Council next week. May God bless you. May he keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and give you rest this week. Hey, Pastor Bill, just catching us just as we're getting done. Hopefully catch you later. Bye, y'all.